Hosting and bandwidth provided by the Blue Box Group. Check them out at bluebox.net. This episode is sponsored by Component One, makers of Widgmo. If you need stunning UI elements or awesome graphs and charts, then go to widgmo.com and check them out.
Don't panic, they'll be paid for most of us.
Hey everybody, and welcome to episode 83 of the JavaScript Jabber Show. This week on our panel we have AJ O'Neill.
Yo, coming at you so live with a brand new 2005 Subaru Impreza Outback.
Jameson Dans.
Hey guys, I'm in my brand new bathrobe.
Very nice, very nice. I'm Charles Max Wood from DevChat.tv, and this week we have a special guest, and that's Matthew Podwysocki.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Glad to be here. I was really excited to hear your the recent show on FRP, and it was a great overall explanation about functional reactive programming. Except for one part, it was like it ended up just being mostly about bacon instead of actually FRP, which is cool. But there are a lot of interesting things going out there in the general reactive world that I think are fairly interesting, and not just FRP, but I think reactive programming in itself is kind of taken off in its own way very recently.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was saying is that it's picked up a lot of momentum, at least I know in the Java community and everywhere else, with Netflix releasing RxJava. And so that's having people being able to, for the first time, really write decent reactive style programming in Java and on the JVM, whether they have bridges to Clojure, to Groovy, Scala, etc. And even beyond that, then the folks at GitHub who tend to be Rx fans themselves went out and created Reactive Cocoa, which are bindings in a way that it takes a lot of the Rx concepts and maps them directly over to Objective-C, which is all very fascinating. So it's kind of this coalescing of all of these things at once. And then on top of that, Eric Meyer and Martin Odersky and company are doing a Coursera course on reactive programming starting, I believe, next month in November. That promises to be very, very interesting about reactive programming in general, not just FRP, but just reactive programming in general. I think it's a very, very interesting time.
So, before we get too far into this, first off, I was wondering if you could just introduce yourself really briefly so people know who you are.
All right, sure. Sorry. So I am Matt Podwysocki. I am with Microsoft. Been there for 7 years now. Been kind of floating all over the place, working with F# early on, and then I started to really get more into the JavaScript side of things because early in my career I had been a JavaScript guy doing healthcare websites, but not healthcare.gov. Earlier in my career, before I joined Microsoft, and then Chris Williams, who's the organizer of JSConf, he and I kind of used to run a lot of the DC developer community, so he and I got to know each other quite well, and I kind of caught the bug from him on JavaScript. So what turns out is that we were talking a lot about Node, especially in the early days, say in the 0.2 time frame, 0.1 time frame, when us fine folks using Windows machines were fairly ignored unless you wanted to somehow compile in Cygwin. And sure enough, I would crawl over broken glass and sure enough compile it because I was that excited about JavaScript on the server. And so I worked throughout Microsoft and trying to build enthusiasm for Node, and that turned into a large investment with MS OpenTech, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Microsoft, which does nothing but cool open source stuff, and able to partner with them and really get Node kicked off. And it's really spread like wildfire throughout the company in our Azure mobile services, our Azure platform, and a lot of other places around the company. So it's really kind of cool. And so for my primary role, I really just work a lot on the Reactive Extensions team in partnership with MS OpenTech. We open sourced all of our Reactive Extensions work back last November timeframe. And since then, it's been kind of catching up and finding out what the community is using and so forth. So it's an exciting time. I'm really excited about where the community is heading, where the libraries are heading, etc.
That's really cool. The next question I have for you is, could you briefly refresh our memories as to what functional reactive programming is? Because we haven't really talked about it for a couple of months, I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, functional reactive programming is the idea. The way I like to describe it is what you're talking about. You're talking about dealing with. Well, let's see. Connell Elliott describes it one way. Everyone describes it kind of a different way. That's really in functional reactive programming. What you have are concepts of arrows and so forth. Hold on, let me think here a little bit. That, to me, it's just basically a way of describing or building blocks on top of regular functional programming. So, you have lists, and then you have map, filter, select, map, reduce, etc. And what functional reactive programming tends to do on top of that is add concepts such as events being these first-class objects like a list is, that you can compose over as well. And so it's kind of viewing these collections rather over time. So instead of, say, a normal collection like an array where you do map, filter for each. So really what it's about is about this notion where you have a time-based action, time-based component into this functional programming, and the reactive part really comes down to events. So what you're talking about is events over time with a really nice composition model that you would use for arrays and so forth in JavaScript.
So you talked a little bit in your intro about the differences between FRP and RP. Well, you mentioned them. Can you go into more of the differences? Because I haven't actually heard of just regular reactive programming. I've only ever heard of it as functional reactive programming.
Yeah, well, it's really reactive programming is just for talking about data flows, dynamic data flows. So it could be where you have flow logic and so forth. One really basic concept that I think everyone would get about reactive programming is Excel. There's not really a functional aspect to it. When I update cell A1 and B1, I expect C2 to change just because I have a formula in there that says react to either of these two changing, and I can sum both of them together in the third cell. So it's the idea that you're reacting to changes in the other cells, and then it gets propagated to your final result cell.
So it almost seems like the functional part is more of an implementation detail, and the reactive part is the core of the idea, and then you can use functional programming to compose these reactive things if you want, but you don't have to.
That's exactly it.
So
okay, that makes sense.
One thing that I've seen with this, I think somebody was showing it off with, I want to say it was with Ember.js. Somebody was showing me that, and basically the way that it works is that this functional reactive programming comes in where you make an AJAX request back to the server, and then it does all the DOM updating and stuff when the response comes back. And so it reacts to getting data from the server effectively.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is absolutely describing reactive programming at its core, is that it's kind of a data flow where you are reacting to an asynchronous operation such as an AJAX request, and sure enough, something gets updated automatically through one piece or another. It's kind of like the Excel example that I gave before. And like I said, the FRP notion is the combination logic, or the kind of the higher order operations that you can do on top of them, like the maps, the filters, reduced, throttles, etc. So it's kind of in addition to.
Sure. So you mentioned RxJS specifically, and you talked a little bit about its differences from Bacon. Do you want to talk a little bit more about RxJS?
Sure.
What it is and how you use it?
So RxJS is an offshoot of, well, I would say it's actually, it goes way back to about 2007, at least the inception of it, for a project called Volta. And what Volta was a way of basically doing tier splitting of your application so that I could write it once, and based upon my target, I could write it as a Silverlight app, I could write it as a Flash app, or I could write it as an HTML5 JavaScript app, all using the same single code base. And what we found is that there were certainly interesting things about that. For example, the idea of first-class events. And basically we were like, dealing with events are kind of a pain, especially when you're going across different implementations. And so we wanted a way to kind of generalize it into a single form and say, we came up with this thing in .NET, was that you could build these hierarchies like map, filter, reduce, etc., on top of generic collections without modifying the underlying collection. So it's fully immutable, goes through the chain, and be lazily evaluated. And we're like, well, this could apply easily to events. So sure enough, that's what we ended up calling it, as early as link to events. And in 2010, Jeffrey Van Gogh and myself started writing RxJS, which was a pure JavaScript port of Rx itself. And there were, of course, a lot of mismatches in terms of threading and mutexes and so forth. But what we found is 100% of the concepts map over very, very well to JavaScript. So whether you're doing callbacks or you're doing AJAX requests or events, we were finding some really, really neat possibilities. So we were trying to create some really cool examples to do that. So let's just cover some of the basics of what Rx really is. And so everyone's pretty familiar with the iterator pattern, gang of 4, where you can get an iterator and then you can move next. And it's kind of a pool sequence where you're pooling items from a collection, and you don't really get anything until you call next. And each language has its own way of doing that, whether it's Java, .NET, ES6 generators, and so forth. And what we found is that the subject-observer pattern in the Gang of 4 book was kind of a way of talking about kind of push-based collections, but in a way. And so we genericized that a little bit and said, really the iterator pattern and the subject-observer patterns are really duals of one another. They're pull collections, and the observables are push collections. So what we have are two main core concepts. We have our consumer, which is our observer, and that has 3 main methods: next, on next, which basically will give you 0 to infinite values based upon how many things you have in your collection. And then optionally, you have an on error, which happens 0 to 1 time, and an optional completion, which happens 0 to 1 time, with either or if the sequence terminates with an error or with a completion. And then on the other side, what we have is the observable, which is basically the producer of data. And its core only has one main method, and that's subscribe, which everything else is built upon. And what subscribe does is basically it runs through the existing source, and you can then compose it with other things. And what it takes in that observer, and what it hands you back is a handle, or what we call a disposable, in which you can call dispose, and it will stop the observable sequence in its tracks. And not only that will it stop the observable sequence, it will also do stuff such as if you're binding to events and such, it will automatically clean up all your event handles for you, so you have no dangling events at all. And it's also pretty useful for things like AJAX requests and so forth. When you want to cancel it before it's done, just call dispose on the subscription, and if it's not done yet, it will try to cancel it. So it's those kinds of the two pieces there, the observer and the observable. And then what we added on there was the kind of the functional reactive aspects to it, in which we added the higher order operations such as map, filter, reduce, and so forth. But reduce is really kind of hard to do on infinite sequence as observables may be. So we added a thing called scan, which is actually just an increment that you get. You get a new reduction and so forth. And time is also a really big component of the reactive extensions. For example, if I want to get the last 5 events, how do I do that? If I want to get the last events in the last 10 seconds, how do I do that? So it's a lot of buffering operations that we have in there. So you can really do some interesting, complex event processing. In one of our demos that we have out there, we have a stock trader demo in which we start pulling data from a stock ticker, and we start doing some really complex algorithms on the streaming data, all in JavaScript, and just breaking down, checking for price spikes, checking for a number of things, highs, lows, averages, and so forth. And this is all with one framework. Now, the third aspect of it is, when we say Rx is observable plus link plus scheduler, so schedulers is really the third part, and actually one of the more important parts that a lot of other people leave out, and which makes RxJS actually fairly unique in that regard. Which is to say that the how, where, and when aspect of how a query gets executed is all controlled by the scheduler. So, for example, we have 3 kind of main built-in ones: immediate, current thread, and timeout. And so immediate does what you think it does. If you have a query to execute immediately, it certainly does. Current thread will try to manage in a queue all of the things that it has queued up for you. And the timeout will basically use the best available and quickest available way of scheduling something immediately as possible, such as using set immediate or process.nextTick or message channels or Windows post message, etc. We also have notions of scheduling in relative and absolute time. So, for example, if I wanted to schedule an observable to fire next Christmas, I can do that all in JavaScript. And then, sure enough, the scheduler will go, okay, I will fire this event next Christmas. How do you test something like that becomes very, very difficult.
Do you have to do stuff to mock out the clock or something?
Exactly. So what we have is, if you look in rx.virtualTime, which is on our GitHub page, we have a notion of a virtual clock. So indeed, you can swap out any of the schedulers at any point and say, I want to switch from normal time to virtual time. And so testing becomes a snap because you no longer have callbacks and asynchronous tests. We can run it through and deterministically say that at 200 milliseconds this happened, at 400 milliseconds this happened, at 500 milliseconds this happened, and then at 600 milliseconds you were done. Every single time. And so if you look at our tests in there, you'll find that's exactly how we test everything and how we tell people to test their applications, is there's no asynchronous behavior involved at all. And they're just able to write deterministic tests about something that's been wildly hard to do in JavaScript, period, which is to write good tests for indeterminate behavior. I don't know about you, but I think that's by default. Testing asynchronous code sucks. It's hard, and it's things like QUnit try to make it easy by having async test and start and so forth, but still that holds up your test because now you're waiting a couple extra milliseconds and hoping that your event fires before then and waiting on set timeouts, and hopefully set timeout cooperates in time. It's those kinds of things that RxJS brings to the table. So we've kind of split it out where we've got a core of objects, and then we have each individual thing has kind of its own purpose. So, for example, RxJS we have time-based operators. We have, such as timers, intervals, timestamps, and so forth. We even have join patterns, so you can say when this event and this event happens, produce this value. When this event and this event happens, produce that value. We also have almost like full SQL query like semantics where you can do group bys, group joins, etc. over time periods, which is really kind of crazy for a lot of things, but it's fairly useful when you find out. You're like, holy crap, I can do that. I can really do like a SQL query over time against, say, a WebSocket. And people are like, wow, you can do that? I'm like, yeah, you can. And where we'd like to go in the future is to go even further than that, is to break it down into more of an expression language, in that I can take the callbacks that you're giving me and break them down into trees and then ship them off to other servers. And so, for example, you could now have RxJS, or rather even Reactive extensions in the cloud, so that you're talking to the Netflix APIs or so forth, all serialized, all in JavaScript, all together. And so you could do you could do IndexedDB queries the same way. You can do web service queries the same way, without really having to change any of your code at all. It's just through the magic of a Sprema or something like that, where you can really go places.
So can you talk a little bit more about that? One of the questions I had coming into this episode was how reactive programming fits into back-end code. Because I feel like all of the examples that I see are for front-end code, where you're responding to user input,
right,
and then you have this sequence of transformations wired together that produce some output. But
right. So there's a product that Microsoft ships as part of SQL Server, which we worked directly with them for, called Stream Insight. And what that was is kind of like a Hadoop yarn kind of thing, what you're trying to do is really deal with real-time data and being able to react to it in some form or fashion through complex event processing and so forth. So on the server side aspect of it all, what you're really trying to do is a lot of buffering and sliding windows of data. For example, if you're doing a high volume transaction system for doing stock trading, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to start to do some time slicing and analysis. Say, give me a 5-second window, give me a 10-second window, or give me a minute window, or 100 changes, either or. Give me those. And then you can start to break those down into further, more concrete things where you can start really performing a lot of business logic to say, okay, the price is spiked here more than 10%. This is good, or this is dropping through the floor. Sell, sell, sell now before it goes down even further. And not only that, but we're talking about, building APIs that are really, really responsive, and Netflix is kind of leading the charge in that respect. And as is GitHub with their OctoKit thing that you just released yesterday, octokit.net, where they released a reactive version using Rx, so that you can basically have these publish and subscribe mechanisms over wide networks and so forth. So you can model any number of things with Rx and even RxJS in particular. To do a lot of really complex business logic where you're taking in large amounts of data at a time, slicing it, dicing it, and making decisions upon it, and just as well building APIs to expose the data in the same kind of way.
That makes sense.
So yeah, that time component is really kind of important, because it's what makes Rx really interesting. Such as the ideas of back pressure, where, for example, you could be firing all of these stock ticker events and so forth. But what if your end system can't stand up to that kind of traffic? Because we're talking massive amounts of data being shoved at you at once. Is there a way to kind of tell the system to back off just a little bit, or resume it, or kind of a speed up or slow down, or kind of in the Node.js style of pause and resume on streams is something that I'm sure we'll be addressing somewhat in the near future. But in the meantime, we have plenty of ways around those kinds of things, whether it's throttling, buffering, etc. That'll get you around that. But it would be a nice thing to have, like an async observable where your on next, on error, and on completed calls are promises or generators that you can then resolve at a later time when you're ready. It's those kinds of things that are fairly interesting as well.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Another question I have about this is that it seems like lots of proponents of reactive programming use it as the organization for the application. Like I don't see lots of people fitting it into Backbone or Angular or Ember. They build an app out of RxJS, not use RxJS inside of some other framework. Is that accurate with what you see? And can you talk about why people do that?
Well, I think there are a number of things, to address that. First off, yes, because I've seen a lot of that because Rx is all-encompassing in that you can build all of the binding logic that you want to through such things as behavior subjects or replay subjects to kind of get that knockout JS kind of look and feel. To do that, in fact, I'm writing some examples to do that for our QCon tutorial we have coming up and so forth, where you can do some really complex binding. And yes, I've found that people are doing that quite a bit, some of the people in the community. But in the meantime, I am seeing some people saying, I would like to really control the scope, for example, in Angular, so that I can delay it and make sure it's unique. So, for example, I have a search string, and I don't want to overload my autocompleter or my type ahead. So I add in things like throttling it by half a second, so I'm not going to react for half a second until you stop typing. And not only that, but I'm also going to make sure that when I'm doing something, that the value is actually changed. So really ensuring that something has worked there. So I'm working on some bindings for Angular directly so that you can turn the HTTP stuff into observables very easily, their promises, and just as well do scope binding and so forth. That'll allow you to do like richer compositions on top of your scope. What I'm hoping to do to really facilitate that is make a kind of a smaller core RxJS to allow people so that if they're using jQuery or Dojo or whatever, that they get the smallest amount of Rx possible, but yet the most important pieces. Because Rx all-encompassing, if you look at our documentation, is quite large, but for the vast majority of UI programmers, they only need a smaller subset. So it's going to create kind of a smaller core piece of that, and then people wouldn't really complain as much instead of adding it to Angular if it's only another 5 to 10K gzipped, then it's really no big deal to add it to your application, and especially if you can find the right points. I've seen it plenty in Backbone and several other places where you're using a subject, which I hadn't explained earlier, but a subject is really nothing more than an observer and an observable all in one. And why it's useful is, what if you wanted to abstract over, say, a WebSocket where you have send and receive operations all in the same thing? Well, a subject is perfect for that. And if you want data binding behavior as well, where you're sending a new value in and you want that value bound to something, well, then you would use something like a behavior subject. So it's getting those right pieces in there where people are starting to use these smaller pieces of Rx. And I'm working with John David Dalton, who's a good friend of mine, and I actually got him hired at Microsoft. And he and I always have these late night conversations about how we can, make things smaller, faster, better, because he is all things perf. And so it's getting to a smaller core, getting it faster, getting it leaner, and and making it easier for people to just suddenly go, why didn't I think of that earlier?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very, very interesting time because people are starting to fold it into to a lot of their applications, and I'm seeing a lot of excitement from a lot of different people. You know, Bacon has certainly taken off in that they have a lot smaller core, and we're certainly getting there ourselves. It was just a matter of finding out what that core really is to be important to most developers, but. For people in the Node world, you know, all bets are off. I mean, you can use the whole kitchen sink there. And we're also working on custom builds to say, okay, I only want these 15 methods, and that's it. Go. And so just building custom grunt operations to do that. So plenty of things to do, that's for sure.
So do you see people out using this in the wild? And do you have like an example of a website or specific things that they're doing with it?
Sure. Actually, there are so Netflix is using it a lot. I'm not sure how public what they're using it for is, other than I know they were using it for a lot of their HTML experience. But ChronoZoom, which is a really cool tool for visualizing kind of the timeline of the universe into small digestible chunks and to really start to dive deep into individual pieces of history. That uses RxJS as well to kind of manage all of their events and pulling in the data and so forth. So it's really this huge, really interactive website. And we have some samples out there as well. You know, it's like some gaming examples that I've done, and I'm working with a few people on integrating it better in their gaming experiences as well. So it's definitely spreading around. But ChronoZoom is certainly one of the ones that gives you kind of a wow factor when you realize RX is handling a lot of what they're doing.
That sounds pretty exciting.
Yeah, it's a very fun project, and I mean it has projects like that have a lot of real opportunity to kind of show off what reactive programming can really do for UIs, because I think people are getting tired of having to register and deregister events manually, keeping track of resources and so forth. And as your applications are getting bigger and more complex, if I can hand you a collection of mouse movements, isn't that a lot easier than, or for example, if I want to describe what a really mouse drag event is, which is mouse move dot select menu or flat map, mouse down, take until mouse up, and then suddenly you've just described in 3 lines how to track when you're dragging your mouse. You didn't have to have 3 different callbacks. You didn't have to have some weird global state hanging around. You, in fact, encoded all the state you ever needed inside this stream. And this stream, then you can pass to any method or you can return from any method. And then when people understand that, they're like, wow, that's a really cool concept, especially in JavaScript as we start to get into more and more interactive sites where touch is starting to become more of a thing, is now we can start passing touch events around. Now we can start passing swipe events around. It's those kinds of things that really open your eyes.
Huh. Sorry, I'm playing with ChronoZoom.
Yeah, it's kind of addicting, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so it's all of those things where people can suddenly just realize the potential of, promises are great for one and done operations, but there really was no pattern for helping people with events. And this FRP style or reactive style that we're doing here really solves a lot of those problems because we handle all the events handling and subscribing and unsubscribing for you. All of the state is within the observable itself, so you don't really have to rely on some global state anywhere. And it just flows through magically. It just makes a lot more sense, and especially since we added in the the testability aspects into that, makes it more compelling. And we have a number of bindings. So if you want to use with jQuery, we have a jQuery binding set. We have HTML DOM binding set where I wrote my own Ajax stack. Thank you very much. That was fun.
It's like a rite of passage.
Yeah, it is, where you write your own JSON-P stack. Yeah, it was good times, and making sure it was compatible all the way back to IE6, because I'm J Dalton that way.
It's like that's so Raven.
Yeah,
so J Dalton.
Exactly. So it was all of that, and then adding on additional things like adding things to the geolocation API, WebSockets, web workers, wrapping all of those things are fairly interesting, and I've done that in our DOM bindings. And so, yeah, people can start to take advantage of RX in their favorite frameworks today quite easily because of that.
Awesome. So where do you see RxJS going from here?
Well, like I said, the expression stuff is awfully interesting. We have a kind of a sister library to it called RxJS, or Interactive Extensions for JavaScript, which is basically the idea is where you have array-like structures, but they're lazily evaluated. So unlike underscore and Lodash, where, when you call map filter, or even on arrays, map filter and all of that are eagerly evaluated each and every step of the way. With IX, it doesn't actually fully execute until you call for each on it, and then it finally fires everything. And so we're able to get a lot better perf for a lot of people who are doing a lot of chaining operations and so forth. And so it's building the expression stuff into there as well. Also, looking into to making a smaller core for people who really want to have a smaller core. We definitely want to tackle ES6 related stuff like generators, promises, and so forth. If we can better integrate with promises and so forth, since they're seeming to become a standard. Node streams, we definitely want to go there a lot more, although there's definitely a mismatch between what they do and what we do, which could be a whole nother show, believe me. And it's a lot of exploration. I mean, we have pretty much a blank canvas, and JavaScript with ES6 and so forth is evolving so much that it gives us a lot of opportunity to do some really interesting things. Object Observe is another thing. How do we integrate Object Observe, mutation observers, and all of that into the core of RX?
Wow, sounds like you're thinking about a lot of things.
Yeah, I'm never short of ideas, that's for sure.
Very nice. Well, we had some technical difficulties getting started, and so this episode's going to be a little bit short, but some of us have some commitments, so we're going to go ahead and start winding down the show. But thanks for coming, Matt.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for having me.
I think I need to go back and listen through this and look up half the stuff you talked about, but...
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Oh, and if you have any questions, you know how to find me.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, we're at Reactive X on the Twitters and at Matt Podwysocki, so you can find me there. And let's keep the conversation going.
Awesome. Yeah, that definitely helps, because then people can reach out to you and, get help, get insight, whatever.
Exactly. And most of all, contribute.
Yes. All right, well, let's go ahead and do the picks. Jameson, what are your picks?
I only have one pick. I had another one, but it sounds like Matt's going to have the same one, and I don't want to steal his thunder. It's an electronic-ish album. I don't like straight-up techno, but I like lots of electronic-tinged music. It's called Caesura by Helios, and I'll post a link to it. And I had to look up how to pronounce that word, because it does not look like how you say it. It's just great, chill, ambient electronic stuff. That's my pick.
Awesome. AJ, what are your picks?
Okay, so I bought a new car, and I'm a tall guy. I'm 6'5". So the one thing that I can't stand about vehicles is that whenever I get in them, I can't see out of the windshield because my eyes are up in that blue zone where it's the sun blocker. So I'm going to pick definitely the car that I bought, which is a 2005 Subaru Impreza Outback, which I love in every way. But also, while I was going around, I found that the Toyota Sequoia was also big enough for me to sit in. The Subaru Outback, the newer ones, are big enough for me to sit in. The Subaru Foresters are big enough for me to sit in. The Impreza was definitely the best. Like, I just sat in the seat and it was like perfect view of windshield, no blind spots. Like, loved it. And then almost everything else sucked because I couldn't see out the windshield.
Is that it?
So you're basically like Dino from the Flintstones, where your head was just popping out of the top of the car?
Yeah, that's basically how it works generally. And like, I hate driving other people's cars. I hate riding with other people. I hate getting a rental car because I never fit. But Honda Civics, the older ones, not the newer ones, but the old Honda Civics, like from the 80s and the really early 90s, those fit me pretty well. And that's what I had, except that I kind of wanted something a little bit cooler.
Gotcha.
And so most cars I am like Dino. I'm sitting in there and I've got. You remember that commercial Taco Neck Syndrome?
Yeah.
From the 90s? Yeah. Yes. That's kind of how I am in the car. I'm just like got my head sideways, smashed up, and my friends are always like, "Oh, my car's plenty roomy. Like, there'll be no problem." And I'm like, "Oh, sure."
Yeah, my brother's 6'5" and he swears by Audis, so
good to know.
Yeah. Yeah, he's got an all-road which has plenty of room.
Yep.
So one thing I don't understand, this idea of the electronic seat mover, backward, forward, or tilter. Because if you have to still reach the lever, why in the world would they make it electronic where you have to wait like 10 seconds for it to move back instead of a manual where you just like pull it, shift, done?
Yeah, true.
Yep. All right. Well, I'm going to jump in with a couple of picks. The first one I have is this Bluetooth speaker that I got for my phone. It's a Jam Pop speaker. Really nice. I got the little bit bigger model, and it sounds pretty good, and it's just nice for me to listen to music or podcasts while I'm working. The other pick that I have, I set up the IKEA standing desk that you can find off of Lifehacker, and put that on my desk, so I've been alternating between sitting and standing, and it's pretty nice too. And so what I do is I just use the Pomodoro technique, and I sit for a Pomodoro, then I stand for a Pomodoro. And anyway, I've been feeling pretty good. I've also been walking over 10,000 steps every day, and honestly, just be active. It's awesome. So I'll put links to those in the show notes, and we'll give Matt a chance to give us his picks.
All right, so my picks are kind of selfish, rather selfish picks, but the first one is Robots Weekly. It's a little Google Hangout that we do semi-regularly where we talk to really cool people doing stuff in industry with robotics. And talked to some really cool guys so far, like Rick Waldron for Johnny 5. We talked to Rockbot about some advanced robotics and JavaScript. Daniel Shaw, Connect Team guys, and so forth. So it's been a lot of fun. And I'll leave it off with RobotsConf, which is a conference for getting software developers into hardware so that they're not afraid to burn their houses down just to play with an Arduino board.
Very nice. Is there a place where we can get recordings of those hangouts, or?
Yeah, if you go to robotsweekly.com, they're all there.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think that's all we've got. So I just want to thank you for coming. We'll mention our silver sponsor, and that is Reg Braithwaite and JavaScript Allongé. Thank him for supporting the show. And yeah, we'll wrap it up and we'll catch y'all next week.